Chapter 1. An Invitation to Merriment. It was the last week of term at Bramley College, and the air buzzed with the excitement of Christmas. Snow dusted the cobbled streets, and wreaths adorned every door. Inside the student common room, Sally Cartwright and Tony Middleton sat huddled by the fire, sipping cocoa and discussing their holiday plans. "I'll be stuck at home with Aunt Harriet's dreadful fruitcake," Tony lamented, stirring his cocoa with a dramatic sigh. "It's like eating a brick soaked in brandy." Sally laughed, her blue eyes sparkling. "That's nothing. My mother has invited half the parish for caroling. I'll be trapped playing hostess while everyone pretends they're on key." Their banter was interrupted by the arrival of Evelyn Blackwood, their classmate. A tall, elegant girl with an air of effortless sophistication, Evelyn always seemed slightly out of place among the students. "Good news," Evelyn announced, her voice carrying the clipped tones of old money. "Uncle Henry has invited a few of us to spend Christmas at Blackwood Manor. It's a tradition, really. Grand feasts, roaring fires, and a proper Christmas tree. You simply must come." Tony perked up instantly. "A country manor, you say? Count me in. I've always wanted to see how the other half lives." Sally raised an eyebrow. "What's the catch, Evelyn? Your uncle doesn't seem the type to invite strangers into his home." Evelyn waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, Uncle Henry loves an audience. He's rather eccentric. Likes to put on a show at Christmas. Besides, the more, the merrier. What do you say?" Before Sally could answer, Tony clapped his hands together. "We're in. When do we leave?" 2 days later, Sally and Tony were on their way, bumping along a snow-covered country road. The Blackwood estate loomed ahead, its spires and chimneys rising against the pale winter sky. "Impressive," Tony murmured, peering out the window. "I feel like we're stepping into a Dickens novel." They pulled up to the grand entrance, where a liveried butler waited to escort them inside. The hall was magnificent. A vast space with polished oak floors, walls lined with ancestral portraits, and a chandelier dripping with crystal. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, its branches laden with candles, baubles, and golden ribbons. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," boomed a jovial voice. Squire Henry Blackwood appeared, a stout man with a ruddy complexion and a white mustache that twitched when he smiled. He wore a velvet smoking jacket and carried a pipe that seemed more for effect than actual use. "You must be Evelyn's friends," he said, shaking their hands vigorously. "I do love young people, so full of energy. You'll find this old house has plenty of stories to tell. Now come along, tea is waiting in the drawing room." The drawing room was equally opulent, with plush armchairs, a roaring fire, and an assortment of mismatched guests. Evelyn introduced them. Arthur Blackwood, the squire's nephew, sat sullenly by the fire, his dark hair falling into his eyes. He offered a curt nod, but said little. Aunt Beatrice, a flamboyant woman dripping in jewelry, clutched a tiny dog to her chest. She greeted them with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Mr. Carruthers, a reserved man in his 40s, sat in a corner reading a leather-bound book. He acknowledged their arrival with a polite bow of his head. The final introduction was to Maggie, the maid, who brought in the tea tray with a nervous smile. As the tea was poured and conversation flowed, Sally observed the group carefully. The dynamics were fascinating. Arthur seemed resentful, Beatrice exuded a forced cheerfulness, and Mr. Carruthers appeared completely detached. Maggie, meanwhile, flitted about like a sparrow, her gaze darting nervously between the guests. "Uncle Henry," Evelyn said suddenly, "you were telling me about the Blackwood chalice. You should show it to everyone." The squire's eyes lit up. "Ah, yes, the pride of the Blackwood family, a goblet of solid gold studded with rubies. It's said to have been a gift from the Queen herself, a treasure like no other." Tony leaned forward, intrigued. "Where do you keep it?" "In the study, under lock and key," the squire replied. "You'll see it tomorrow, my boy. Tonight, let us focus on the festivities." The evening passed in a haze of merriment. The guests gathered in the dining hall for a sumptuous feast, complete with roast goose, plum pudding, and endless glasses of mulled wine. Tony, ever the entertainer, regaled the table with stories of their college escapades, earning laughter from most and a disapproving sniff from Aunt Beatrice. After dinner, they played charades, and Tony's over-the-top impression of a chimney sweep had everyone in stitches. Even Arthur cracked a reluctant smile. As the night wore on, Sally couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She caught glimpses of hushed conversations, furtive glances, and even thought she heard footsteps in the corridor when no one was there. But it was late, and the cozy warmth of her guest room soon lulled her into sleep. Chapter 2. Mistletoe and Mischief. The next morning, Blackwood Manor awoke to the faint chiming of the clock tower and the muffled sounds of snow falling outside. The estate was cloaked in a picturesque white blanket, and the faint scent of pine and cinnamon wafted through the halls. Sally and Tony, invigorated by the crisp morning air, made their way to the breakfast room. The spread was lavish. Steaming platters of eggs, sausages, fresh scones, and pots of marmalade lined the table. Squire Blackwood, already seated with a newspaper in hand, looked up and greeted them with a booming, "Good morning! Did you sleep well? This old house can creak and groan like an orchestra in the night." Tony grinned as he reached for a scone. "Slept like a log, though I did hear what sounded like footsteps outside my door. Thought it might be one of your famous Blackwood ghosts." The squire chuckled, but Evelyn rolled her eyes. "Don't encourage him, Uncle Henry. Tony's likely to start spinning tales of haunted goblets next." "Well, you can't deny this place has character," Sally said, pouring herself a cup of tea. "I half expected to see a ghostly figure in the halls." The conversation shifted to the day's festivities. Squire Blackwood had planned a full slew of activities, from decorating the massive Christmas tree in the drawing room to a sleigh ride through the snowy countryside. But as the guests trickled into the breakfast room, the air grew thick with undercurrents of tension. Arthur Blackwood entered, his dark mood casting a shadow over the bright morning. He barely acknowledged anyone as he took his seat and began eating in silence. Aunt Beatrice followed shortly after, dressed in a dramatic crimson robe that clashed with the cheery decorations. She seemed in high spirits, chattering away about the upcoming sleigh ride, but her glances toward Arthur were sharp and probing. Mr. Carruthers arrived last, his face pale and his demeanor distracted. He carried a small notebook, which he placed on the table as he nibbled on a piece of toast. "Good heavens, Carruthers, you look like you've seen a ghost!" Aunt Beatrice exclaimed, though her tone was more mocking than concerned. "Just didn't sleep well, that's all," he replied tersely, avoiding her gaze. Sally leaned toward Tony and whispered, "Doesn't he seem a bit off?" Tony nodded, stuffing a bite of sausage into his mouth. "Definitely the brooding type. Maybe he's composing poetry about snowflakes." The morning passed with the guests gathering in the drawing room to decorate the tree. Squire Blackwood produced a dusty box of antique ornaments, each with its own story. As he regaled the group with tales of Christmases past, Arthur sat apart, sipping a glass of sherry and glaring into the fire. Tony, ever the mischief maker, found a sprig of mistletoe and held it over Sally's head. "Tradition, Sally. You know the rules." Sally swatted it away, laughing. "Put that thing down before someone thinks you're serious!" The moment broke the tension, and even Evelyn chuckled. But just as the atmosphere began to lighten, Aunt Beatrice accidentally, or perhaps deliberately, knocked over an ornament, shattering it on the floor. "Oh, how clumsy of me!" she exclaimed, though her expression betrayed no remorse. Arthur, who had been watching from the sidelines, muttered under his breath, "You're always breaking things that don't belong to you." "What was that, Arthur?" Beatrice asked, her tone sweet, but her eyes narrowing in anger. "Nothing," he replied, draining his glass and leaving the room. Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. That wasn't just about the ornament, was it? She murmured. After lunch, the sleigh ride was announced. The guests bundled up and made their way to the stables, where two large sleighs awaited, their runners gleaming in the sunlight. The horses, adorned with jingling bells, stomped impatiently in the snow. Sally and Tony joined Evelyn, Arthur, and Mr. Carruthers in the first sleigh, while Squire Blackwood and Aunt Beatrice took the second. The ride was picturesque, with snowflakes dancing in the air and the countryside stretching out like a postcard. But the cheerful atmosphere was soon interrupted by a sudden jolt. The first sleigh hit a patch of ice, sending it careening off the path and into a snowdrift. Everyone tumbled out in a flurry of shouts and laughter. Tony emerged with snow in his hair, looking like a disgruntled snowman. "Who's driving this thing? A blind elf?" he grumbled, brushing himself off. Evelyn helped him up, smirking. "You've got to admit it adds a bit of adventure to the day." As they righted the sleigh and resumed their journey, Sally noticed Mr. Carruthers scribbling in his notebook, his brow furrowed. The day ended with the group gathered in the dining hall for another lavish feast. The squire was in high spirits, regaling them with stories of his youth, but the undercurrents of tension remained. Arthur drank more than usual, his remarks growing sharper as the evening progressed. Beatrice, seemingly unbothered, continued to play the gracious hostess, but her smiles were as brittle as the ice outside. As the clock struck 10, Squire Blackwood stood and raised a glass. "To family, friends, and the joys of Christmas, may this season bring us all closer together." The guests echoed the toast, though some with less enthusiasm than others. Later that night, as Sally prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing beneath the surface. The strained dynamics among the guests, the peculiar behavior of Mr. Carruthers, and Arthur's brooding. "Do you think there's more to this crowd than meets the eye?" she asked Tony, as he passed her room on the way to his own. Tony grinned. "Absolutely. And if there's one thing I've learned, Sally, it's that where there's smoke, there's usually a fire, or at least a decent mystery." Sally smiled, but her mind remained restless. Chapter 3. The Stolen Chalice. Sally and Tony descended the grand staircase, chatting about the day's plans. "I'm hoping for a bit more sleighing," Tony said, adjusting his scarf, though perhaps this time without the impromptu snowdrift excursion. They entered the dining room and found Evelyn pacing, her face pale. The table, usually laden with food and bustling with conversation, was eerily empty. "What's going on?" Sally asked. "It's Uncle Henry. He's in a terrible state. Something dreadful has happened," Evelyn said. Before she could elaborate, Squire Blackwood burst into the room, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by agitation. "The Blackwood chalice!" he exclaimed, his voice trembling. "It's gone. Stolen." "The chalice? The one you said was locked in your study?" Tony asked. "Yes," the squire bellowed. "I went to show it to Carruthers this morning, as he seemed so interested in family artifacts, and when I unlocked the cabinet, it was empty." The dining room erupted into chaos as the other guests arrived. Aunt Beatrice was the first to speak, clutching her pearls dramatically. "Stolen? From right under our noses?" Arthur scoffed. "Hardly surprising. You've always been careless, Uncle." The squire glared at him. "Careless? I kept it under lock and key, as I always do. This is no accident, Arthur. Someone in this house is a thief." Tony leaned toward Sally. "I'd wager 10 shillings this isn't just about the chalice. There's something else simmering here." Squire Blackwood summoned the local constable, Sergeant Peters, a stout man with a no-nonsense demeanor. As Peters questioned the household, Sally and Tony couldn't resist hovering nearby, their curiosity piqued. The first person Peters questioned was Maggie, the maid. She stood nervously, wringing her apron. I didn't see anything, sir," she stammered. "I was in the kitchen all morning helping with the breakfast." "Did you notice anything unusual last night or this morning?" Peters pressed. Maggie hesitated. Well, I did hear footsteps in the hall late last night, after everyone had gone to bed. But I didn't think much of it. This house is always creaking and groaning. Tony nudged Sally. Footsteps in the hall. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Let's not jump to conclusions, Sally whispered back. We need more than just footsteps. Next, Peters turned his attention to the guests. Aunt Beatrice was all indignation and outrage. Are you implying that I, a woman of my standing, would stoop to theft? The very idea. And where were you last night? Peters asked, unfazed by her theatrics. In my room, of course, she huffed. I retired early. Ask anyone. Arthur was more combative. This is ridiculous. Why would I want some dusty old goblet? I have no use for family relics. Where were you last night, Mr. Blackwood? Peters asked pointedly. In the library, Arthur replied curtly. Reading. Alone. Mr. Carruthers was the last to be questioned. I was in my room writing notes for a book I'm working on, Carruthers replied. I'm an antiquarian by trade, and the chalice intrigued me. I was documenting its history based on what the Squire told me. Tony raised an eyebrow. As the morning wore on, tensions in the house reached a boiling point. The Squire paced the halls, muttering about the shame of losing the family's most prized possession. Aunt Beatrice flitted about, alternately consoling him and casting suspicious glances at Arthur and Carruthers. Evelyn tried to maintain order, but even her composure was beginning to fray. Sally and Tony retreated to the drawing room to discuss their observations. It's strange, isn't it? Sally said. Everyone had a motive in their own way. Aunt Beatrice could sell the chalice to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Arthur resents his uncle and might want to hurt him. And Carruthers, well, he seems just a bit too fascinated by it all. And don't forget Maggie, Tony added. She might not have a motive, but she could have been an easy scapegoat. I think it's time we did a little investigating of our own. Their first stop was the study, which Peters had left unguarded while he continued questioning the household. The display cabinet stood in the corner, its glass door ajar and its interior empty. Not much to see here, Tony said. Whoever took the chalice was careful not to leave a mess. Sally examined the lock. It doesn't look forced. Either the thief had a key, or they're very skilled at picking locks. Tony glanced around the room. What about that? He pointed to a faint smudge on the windowsill. Sally crouched to examine it. A footprint. It looks like someone climbed in or out through the window. Interesting, Tony said. But why go through the trouble of sneaking in if they had access to the house? Sally straightened. Maybe they wanted to make it look like an outsider did it. She knelt beside the window, examining the faint smudge. The footprint wasn't complete, but it was distinct enough to reveal some important details. It's not very large, she murmured. Not a man's boot. Perhaps a woman's shoe or a smaller foot. Tony crouched beside her, tilting his head. Look at the edges. It's smudged, as though someone tried to wipe it away. A hasty job, though. Sally nodded. And there's something else. She pointed to a thin trail of what appeared to be dirt or ash leading from the windowsill to the floor. The trail stopped abruptly near the desk. Tony followed the line with his eyes. Could they have dropped something? Or maybe brushed off their boots? Possibly, Sally said. But it's odd that the trail ends so suddenly. Let's check the desk. The large oak desk was cluttered with papers, an ink pot, and a half-burned candle. Sally rifled through the papers but found nothing unusual. Then, her eyes caught a faint scratch on the wooden surface near the edge. Look at this, she said. It's as if someone set something heavy down here. Something with a sharp edge. Tony frowned. Like the chalice, maybe? Could be, Sally said thoughtfully. If the thief placed it here before leaving, it might explain the sudden stop in the dirt trail. But why risk taking it through the house when they could have gone straight out the window? Tony shrugged. Maybe they planned to hide it somewhere in the house? They could come back for it later when the coast was clear? Their investigation of the study continued as they checked the window itself. The latch was slightly loose, and when Sally jiggled it, the entire frame shifted slightly. "This window is old," she noted. "It wouldn't take much effort to pry it open from the outside." Tony peered out into the snowy grounds. The garden below had no sign of footprints. If someone came in this way, they were careful not to leave a trail in the snow. "Or they wiped it away," Sally said. "But it still doesn't explain how they avoided making a mess inside." Tony nodded. "Which means they might have changed their shoes." Sally opened a small cabinet. Nothing seemed out of place until she noticed a small piece of torn fabric caught on the cabinet's edge. "Tony, look at this." She held up the scrap. It was dark green and made of fine wool. Tony examined it. "That's not from any of the servants' uniforms. It looks expensive." "Exactly," Sally said. "And I think I've seen this shade of green before." Tony's eyes lit up. "Beatrice's dress from yesterday." Sally nodded. "Or Evelyn's. She wore green, too." Before leaving the study, they examined the lock on the cabinet where the chalice had been kept. It was a sturdy brass mechanism, and Sally noticed faint scratches around the keyhole. "Someone tried to pick this," she said, pointing to the marks. Tony leaned in. "Not very neatly, either. Do you think they succeeded?" "Unlikely," Sally replied. "The Squire said he used the key to open it this morning, which means it wasn't forced. But if they had a copy of the key, or the real one, then they'd have no trouble getting in. We'll need to find out who had access to the keys." Their next stop was the corridor outside the study, where they inspected the floor for any additional clues. Sally spotted a faint scuff mark near the baseboard, as though something had been dragged across the wooden floor. "Look at this," she said, pointing it out to Tony. He examined the mark. "It's too narrow to be from furniture. Maybe a bag or a box?" "If they carried the chalice out in something, it would explain why they didn't leave any obvious footprints or dirt trails," Sally said. "But it doesn't explain why they didn't take it out through the window," Tony countered. Sally sighed. "True. Which means we're missing something." As they left the study, they passed Maggie in the hall. Sally noticed a smudge of dirt on Maggie's apron and filed it away as a potential clue. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Snow. The tension in Blackwood Manor had thickened by midday. Snow fell steadily outside, while inside, voices echoed through the halls as Sergeant Peters continued his interviews. Sally and Tony, undeterred by the gravity of the situation, had decided to divide their efforts. "We've gathered some interesting clues," Sally said, as they walked down a dimly lit corridor. "The fabric scrap, the smudge on the windowsill, the scuff marks near the study, but it's all fragmented. We need context." Tony nodded. "I'll start chatting up the suspects. A little charm can go a long way." He winked. "And I'll check outside the study window," Sally replied. "If there's anything to find in the garden, it'll be buried under the snow soon." Tony's investigation. Tony found his first target, Aunt Beatrice, in the drawing room, reclining on a chaise lounge and sipping tea. She looked up as he entered, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Ah, young Mr. Middleton," she said with a hint of disdain. "Come to interrogate me, have you? Everyone seems to think I'm some sort of criminal." "Not at all, Aunt Beatrice," Tony replied smoothly, taking a seat across from her. "I thought I'd check on you. You must be quite shaken. Such an upsetting event in your own family." She sighed dramatically. "It's a disgrace, that's what it is. Poor Henry. He's always been too trusting, letting all sorts of people wander about the house. It's no wonder something like this happened." "Do you mean the guests?" Tony asked innocently. Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. "Not just the guests, dear boy, the staff, too. They're always lurking about, poking their noses where they don't belong. I wouldn't be surprised if one of them took it." Tony raised an eyebrow. "But wouldn't the chalice be difficult to sell? It's quite famous, isn't it? Beatrice hesitated, her teacup poised mid-air. Well, perhaps, but you never know with these sorts of people. Desperation drives them to foolish things. Tony smiled politely, but noted her evasion. And you, Aunt Beatrice? Where were you when all this happened? She bristled. In my room, as I've already told that dreadful constable. Honestly, do I look like someone who'd skulk about in the middle of the night, stealing goblets? Tony glanced at her emerald green dress and the sparkling jewels at her neck. You do seem to have excellent taste, he said lightly. I suppose that's why the Squire values your opinion so much on family heirlooms. Her eyes narrowed. Flattery won't get you anywhere, young man. I know what you're implying. Tony shrugged, just making conversation. Next, Tony found Arthur in the billiard room, practicing his shots with an air of indifference. Bit of a mess, isn't it? Tony said, leaning against the doorframe. Arthur snorted. Mess is putting it mildly. It's a circus. You don't seem too concerned, Tony observed. Arthur shrugged, lining up his next shot. Why should I be? It's not my chalice. Frankly, I think the old man's obsession with it is ridiculous. It's just a piece of metal. Not to your uncle, Tony said. He seemed genuinely upset. Arthur straightened, his expression darkening. Of course he is. That chalice represents everything he values. Tradition, legacy, all that rubbish. He cares more about that thing than his own family. Strong words, Tony remarked. Arthur smirked. Just calling it as I see it. If you ask me, this whole fiasco is poetic justice. Maybe now he'll learn to focus on the living instead of the dead. Tony filed the comment away, sensing deeper resentment beneath Arthur's nonchalance. Sally's discovery. While Tony worked his charm indoors, Sally braved the snow, bundled in her coat and scarf. She retraced the thief's supposed escape route, starting at the study window. The garden was serene, the snow undisturbed save for a faint indentation near the base of the window. Sally crouched to examine it, brushing away the fresh powder to reveal the faint outline of a boot print. It's larger than I expected, she muttered. Definitely not Maggie's or Evelyn's, perhaps Arthur's or Carruthers. Nearby she noticed a patch of disturbed snow leading toward the hedge that bordered the property. She followed the trail, her breath clouding in the frosty air. At the hedge, she found a broken branch dangling precariously. Beneath it, another faint boot print marked the ground. Beyond the hedge, the trail disappeared, but Sally's sharp eyes caught something glinting in the snow. She knelt and retrieved the object, a small silver button, slightly tarnished, but still intact. A clue, she whispered, holding it up to the light. A meeting of minds. Back inside, Sally and Tony reconvened in the library to compare notes. I found this in the garden, Sally said, showing Tony the button. It looks like it was torn from someone's coat. Tony examined it closely. Could be Arthur's. His coat has silver buttons. It could, Sally said, but it could also belong to Carruthers. His overcoat is similar. Tony leaned back, his expression thoughtful. And Aunt Beatrice? Any signs she's hiding something? She was quick to blame the staff, Tony said, but she got defensive when I mentioned her interest in the chalice. What about Evelyn? I haven't spoken to her yet, Sally admitted, but I doubt she'd be careless enough to leave a trail like this. Tony grinned. So we're down to Arthur, Carruthers, or someone we haven't considered yet. Or, Sally said, her eyes narrowing, the thief could be deliberately planting evidence to mislead us. Tony's grin faded. You think we're being played? Sally shrugged. It's possible, but we won't know until we dig deeper. Let's talk to Carruthers next. Chapter 5. Carruthers Under Fire. Carruthers was in the sitting room when Sally and Tony found him, sipping from a steaming cup of tea. His calm demeanor contrasted with the growing tension in the manor. and he greeted the young sleuths with a raised eyebrow. "Ah, the inquisitive duo," he said, setting his cup down. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Another round of amateur sleuthing?" Tony grinned, unfazed by the sarcasm. "Something like that. Mind if we ask you a few questions, Mr. Carruthers?" Carruthers leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I suppose it would be rude to refuse, considering the circumstances. Fire away." Sally began, her tone measured. "You were in the dining room last night during the caroling, correct?" Carruthers nodded. "That's right. A dull affair, if you ask me. I've never had much of a singing voice, so I stayed out of it." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Sally pressed. Carruthers shrugged. "Not particularly. The staff were bustling about as they always do. Beatrice was holding court by the fire, Arthur sulked in his corner, and Evelyn fluttered about like a nervous sparrow. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Did you leave the dining room at any point?" Tony asked, leaning forward. Carruthers hesitated, his gaze flickering briefly. "I stepped out to fetch a book from the library. I was gone for no more than 5 minutes." "Did anyone see you?" Sally asked, her eyes narrowing. Carruthers chuckled dryly. "No, I don't believe so. Unless the walls have eyes." Sally exchanged a glance with Tony. "You're aware that the study is near the library, aren't you?" Carruthers arched an eyebrow. "I am. Are you suggesting I detoured into the study to pilfer the chalice?" Tony leaned back, adopting a casual air. "We're not suggesting anything, Mr. Carruthers, but it's curious that you were near the scene of the crime at a crucial moment." Sally decided to take a more direct approach. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver button she'd found in the garden. "Does this look familiar to you?" Carruthers frowned, leaning forward to examine the button. His expression was unreadable as he picked it up. "It's a common design," he said after a moment. "Could belong to anyone." "It could," Sally agreed, "but it's also a perfect match for the buttons on your overcoat." Carruthers' jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. "Are you implying that I lost this button while sneaking about in the snow? That's quite the leap, Miss Cartwright." "Not necessarily," Sally said calmly, "but it's a curious coincidence, don't you think?" Carruthers leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Coincidences happen, Miss Cartwright. Unless you have more substantial evidence, I suggest you be careful with your accusations." A sudden shift. Before Sally could respond, Evelyn entered the room, her face pale and drawn. She stopped short when she saw them, her hands twisting nervously. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt," she stammered. "You're not interrupting," Tony said, flashing her a reassuring smile. "In fact, we were hoping to speak with you next." Evelyn's eyes widened. "Me? But I don't know anything." "Everyone knows something, Evelyn," Sally said gently. "Why don't you sit down?" Evelyn perched on the edge of a chair, looking like a frightened bird. Carruthers observed her with mild amusement, but Sally caught the flicker of unease in his expression. "We'll get to you in a moment, Evelyn," Tony said, turning back to Carruthers. "One last question, Mr. Carruthers. Where is your overcoat?" Carruthers hesitated, his composure slipping for the first time. "In the cloakroom, I assume. Where else would it be?" "Perhaps we should check," Sally said, standing. Carruthers' lips thinned, but he didn't protest as they made their way to the cloakroom. Inside, a row of coats hung neatly on wooden pegs, and Sally quickly located Carruthers' overcoat. She examined it closely, her fingers running over the buttons. One was missing. "Interesting," Tony said, crossing his arms. "Care to explain this, Mr. Carruthers?" Carruthers' face darkened. "I don't have to explain anything. This is absurd." "Absurd or not," Sally said, holding up the button, "this places you near the garden where the thief likely escaped. And combined with your proximity to the study last night..." Carruthers stepped forward, his tone icy. "Enough. I'm no thief, and I won't stand for these baseless accusations. If you want answers, I suggest you look elsewhere." Evelyn speaks. Carruthers stormed out, leaving Sally and Tony alone with Evelyn. The young woman fidgeted nervously, her gaze darting to the door. "Evelyn," Sally said softly, "is there something you're not telling us?" Evelyn hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. I don't know if it's important." "Everything's important," Tony said encouragingly. "Just tell us what you saw." Evelyn bit her lip. "Last night, after the caroling, I went to the kitchen to fetch some water. On my way back, I thought I saw someone near the study. It was dark, but I think it was Mr. Carruthers." Sally and Tony exchanged a look. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Sally asked gently. "I wasn't sure," Evelyn admitted, "and I didn't want to cause trouble. Mr. Carruthers can be intimidating." Sally placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "You've done the right thing, Evelyn. Thank you." As they left the cloakroom, Tony turned to Sally. "So, what do you think? Is Carruthers our thief?" Sally frowned. "He's certainly hiding something, but I'm not convinced he's the culprit. Not yet." "Then what's next?" Tony asked. Sally's eyes sparkled with determination. "We need to follow the trail, and I have a feeling the chalice isn't as far away as we think." Chapter 6. The study yields its secrets. By early evening, the manor seemed to settle into an uneasy calm. Snow continued to fall outside, muffling the sounds of the world beyond, while the guests and staff moved cautiously, aware of the tension brewing under Blackwood Manor's grand roof. Sally and Tony, however, were anything but calm. Having questioned Carruthers and Evelyn, they felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together, but there was still something missing. Sally was convinced the answer lay in the study itself, the scene of the crime. "Tony," Sally said as they regrouped in the library, "we need to take another look at the study. Something's been bothering me about it since we first went in." Tony raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Sally frowned. The study was immaculate, not a single thing out of place except for the broken lock on the display cabinet. Doesn't that strike you as odd? "Maybe the thief was in a hurry," Tony suggested. "Or maybe they were trying to make it look like a straightforward theft," Sally countered. "Either way, I think we missed something." Tony nodded. "Right then, to the study we go." The search resumes. The study was quiet and dimly lit. The scent of old leather and polished wood filled the air, and the flickering light from the fireplace cast long shadows across the room. Sally and Tony began their search methodically, starting with the display cabinet. The broken lock still hung loosely from the door, its jagged edges gleaming in the light from the fire. Sally crouched down, examining the area around the cabinet. There's no sign of forced entry anywhere else in the room. The thief must have known exactly where the chalice was kept. "Inside job?" Tony suggested. "Possibly," Sally said. She ran her fingers along the edges of the cabinet, then stopped abruptly. "Look at this." Tony leaned closer as Sally pointed to a faint smudge on the glass. "Is that a fingerprint?" he asked. "It's too faint to tell," Sally replied, "but it's definitely worth noting." She stood and turned her attention to the desk. It was large and imposing, its surface cluttered with papers, quills, and an ink blotter. She began sifting through the documents, careful not to disturb the arrangement too much. Meanwhile, Tony moved to the fireplace, where he noticed a small pile of ash and charred paper. "Looks like someone's been burning something," he said, poking at the remnants with the fireplace tongs. Sally joined him, peering over his shoulder. "What is it?" Tony fished out a partially burned piece of paper and handed it to her. The edges were blackened, but the center was still legible. "It's part of a letter," Sally said, squinting at the smudged handwriting. "Arrive at midnight. Ensure no witnesses." That's all I can make out. "Midnight?" Tony repeated. "That's around the time the chalice was stolen." Sally nodded, her mind racing. Whoever wrote this was planning something, and they didn't want anyone to know. As Sally pondered the letter, Tony continued his search. His attention was drawn to the large bookshelf that lined one wall of the study. Something about its symmetry seemed too perfect, too deliberate. "Bookshelves like this always have a trick," he said, running his fingers along the edges. "Careful, Tony," Sally warned. "We don't want to accidentally destroy the Squire's prized collection." Tony grinned. "Relax. I'm a professional." After a few minutes of probing, his fingers found a small notch at the base of one shelf. He pressed it, and with a soft click, a section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Sally's eyes widened. "Tony, you genius!" Inside the compartment was a small velvet pouch. Sally carefully removed it and opened it to reveal a set of ornate keys. "These must be the keys to the manor," she said, holding them up, including the key to the display cabinet. Tony frowned. "But if the thief had the key, why break the lock?" "To make it look like a break-in," Sally said. "But why hide the keys here? It doesn't make sense." "Unless the thief wanted to throw us off the scent," Tony suggested. Sally nodded. "Let's show these to Sergeant Peters. He needs to know about this." Before the two friends could leave the study, the door creaked open, and Arthur stepped inside. He froze when he saw them, looking shocked. "What are you two doing in here?" he demanded. "Looking for clues," Sally said evenly. Arthur's gaze flicked to the open bookshelf and the keys in Sally's hand. "You've been snooping around where you don't belong." "Just like someone else did last night?" Tony shot back. Arthur's jaw tightened. "I don't have to explain myself to you, but if you're so keen on playing detective, maybe you should start looking at the staff. They're the ones who have access to every room in this house." "And yet you were near the study around the time of the theft," Sally said, watching him closely. "Evelyn saw you." Arthur's face flushed. "I was looking for my uncle. I thought he might be in here." "And did you find him?" Tony asked. "No," Arthur snapped. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have better things to do than entertain your ridiculous accusations." He stormed out, leaving Sally and Tony to exchange a glance. "Touchy, isn't he?" Tony remarked. Sally frowned. "He's hiding something, but so is Carruthers, and I still don't trust Aunt Beatrice." Tony sighed. "So many suspects, so little time." Sally smiled faintly. "Then we'd better get to work." Chapter 7. Aunt Beatrice's Secrets. The Manor's grand sitting room was alive with the glow of firelight and the soft ticking of the antique grandfather clock. Sally and Tony had regrouped after their encounter with Arthur and decided it was time to speak with Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was seated in her usual spot by the fire, a cup of tea resting on the table beside her. She appeared serene, but her sharp eyes hinted at a mind that was constantly at work. Sally knew she was no ordinary woman. Beatrice had a reputation for her quick wit and her ability to navigate the complexities of social politics. "Ah, there you are," Beatrice said as they approached. "I was wondering when you two would come sniffing around." Tony chuckled. "Sniffing is a bit harsh, Aunt Beatrice. We're just trying to get to the bottom of this mess." "Are you now?" Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her tone dry. "Well, sit down then. I suppose you'll be wanting to interrogate me next." Sally smiled politely as she and Tony took their seats. "We wouldn't call it an interrogation, Mrs. Blackwood, but we do have a few questions." "A candid conversation," Sally began with a disarming question. "Mrs. Blackwood, how well do you know Carruthers?" Beatrice's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Carruthers? That pompous windbag? I know him well enough to steer clear of him at dinner parties. Why do you ask?" "He seems to have been in the vicinity of the study last night," Sally said carefully. Beatrice's smirk faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. "Carruthers is a man who thrives on appearances. If he's skulking about in the dark, he's up to something. Mark my words." "And what about Arthur?" Tony interjected. Beatrice's expression hardened. Arthur is a fool, always has been. He fancies himself a great businessman, but he's nothing more than a gambler with expensive tastes. If you're asking whether he could be involved in this theft, I wouldn't put it past him. Sally leaned forward. You don't seem very fond of your nephew, Mrs. Blackwood. Beatrice sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. Fondness has little to do with it, my dear. Arthur has been a disappointment to this family for years. He's squandered more opportunities than I can count. Sally decided to change tack. Can you tell us where you were during the caroling last night? Beatrice's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting I had something to do with this theft? Not at all, Sally said smoothly. We're just trying to piece together everyone's movements. Beatrice's gaze remained sharp, but she eventually relented. Very well. I was in the drawing room with Lady Marston and her insufferable husband. We were discussing, if you can call it that, his collection of antique coins. I didn't leave the room until the caroling was over. Did anyone see you leave? Tony asked. Beatrice hesitated, her composure slipping for the briefest moment. I don't recall, but I can assure you I had no reason to venture near the study. Sally noted the hesitation, but decided not to press further just yet. Instead, she reached into her pocket and produced the charred piece of paper they had found in the study. Do you recognize this? She asked, holding it out. Beatrice took the paper, her brow furrowing as she examined it. Where did you find this? In the fireplace in the study, Sally replied. It appears to be part of a letter. We were hoping you might recognize the handwriting. Beatrice's expression darkened as she handed the paper back. I can't say I do, but whoever wrote it seems to have been planning something quite devious. As they spoke, Sally's eyes drifted to the elaborate brooch pinned to Beatrice's dress. It was a striking piece, adorned with emeralds and diamonds. But what caught Sally's attention was the clasp. It was identical to the clasp on the velvet pouch they had found in the hidden compartment. That's a beautiful brooch, Sally said casually. Is it part of a set? Beatrice's hand instinctively went to the brooch, her expression guarded. It was a gift from my late husband. Why do you ask? Sally smiled innocently. No reason. It just reminded me of something we found earlier. And what, pray tell, did you find? Said Beatrice pointedly. Sally hesitated, debating how much to reveal. A velvet pouch, hidden in a secret compartment in the study. It contained a set of keys to the Manor. Beatrice's face remained impassive, but Sally could sense the tension beneath her composed exterior. Interesting, Beatrice said finally. And you think this has something to do with the theft? We're not sure yet, Tony said, but it's a curious find, don't you think? Beatrice's lips thinned. Curious indeed, but I assure you, I have no knowledge of any secret compartments or velvet pouches. Perhaps you should direct your questions to someone else. As the conversation wound down, Sally and Tony exchanged a glance. Beatrice was a skilled conversationalist, but she had let slip more than she intended. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Blackwood, Sally said as they stood. Beatrice nodded curtly. Do let me know if you find anything of substance. As they left the sitting room, Tony turned to Sally. Well, that was enlightening. What do you think? Sally frowned, her mind racing. I think Aunt Beatrice knows more than she's letting on. That brooch is the key, I'm sure of it. But we'll need more evidence before we confront her. Back to the drawing board, then? Tony asked. Sally nodded. Back to the drawing board. Chapter 8. The Breakthrough. The snowstorm had grown fiercer overnight, blanketing the manor and its grounds in an almost ethereal silence. Inside Blackwood Manor, everyone seemed to tread lightly, their conversations hushed, their movements careful. For Sally and Tony, however, the morning was anything but quiet. Their discoveries from the previous day still churned in their minds, and as the clock struck 10, they gathered in the library to regroup and plan their next move. We're close, Tony, Sally said, pacing in front of the fireplace. The velvet pouch, the hidden compartment, Aunt Beatrice's brooch, they're all connected somehow. We just need to figure out how. Tony, sprawled on a leather armchair, nodded thoughtfully. And let's not forget the burnt letter. Someone went to great lengths to destroy it. But why? Sally paused, staring into the flames. It mentioned midnight and ensuring no witnesses. That's a direct link to the timing of the theft. If we could piece together the rest of that letter, we might have our answer. Tony grinned. Then let's get to work. Where do we start? The two sleuths decided to return to the study, hoping a fresh perspective might reveal something they had missed. The room was as they had left it. The broken display cabinet still stood as a stark reminder of the theft, and the faint smell of charred paper still lingered near the fireplace. Sally began examining the desk again, this time focusing on the drawers. If someone wrote that letter here, there might be drafts or scraps of paper left behind. Tony, meanwhile, turned his attention back to the bookshelf. There's something about this hidden compartment that's still bugging me, he said, running his fingers along the edges. As Sally sifted through the desk's contents, she found a stack of correspondence addressed to Squire Blackwood. Most were mundane, letters from tenants, invitations to social events, but one envelope caught her eye. This is odd, she said, pulling it out. What's odd? Tony asked, glancing over. This envelope, Sally said, holding it up. It's addressed to the Squire, but the handwriting looks familiar. Tony crossed the room to examine it. It's the same handwriting as the burnt letter. Sally nodded. And it's postmarked 3 days ago. Whatever's inside might tell us who wrote that letter. She carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter within. The handwriting was unmistakably the same, and the message was chilling. The chalice must be taken before the gathering. Midnight is the perfect time. Ensure no witnesses. Leave no trace. Tony let out a low whistle. That's as clear as it gets. Someone was planning this for days. But who? Sally wondered aloud. The letter doesn't name anyone, and there's no signature. Let's think about it, Tony said. Who had the most to gain from stealing the chalice? Sally's mind raced. Carruthers could sell it for a fortune. Arthur might use it to cover his debts. Aunt Beatrice, well, she's harder to read, but I wouldn't put it past her to orchestrate something like this. And Evelyn? Tony added. She's the only one who seemed genuinely shocked by the theft, but that could be an act. As they discussed the letter, Tony returned to the bookshelf. There's got to be more to this hidden compartment, he muttered. He pressed the notch again, and the compartment swung open. This time he examined it more closely, running his fingers along the interior walls. Wait a second, he said, his voice sharp with excitement. There's something here. Sally hurried over as Tony pulled out a small folded piece of parchment tucked into the back of the compartment. What is it? She asked. Tony unfolded it carefully. It was a map of the manor grounds, marked with a series of red X's. This is no ordinary map, Sally said, studying it. These X's must mark hiding places or escape routes. Tony pointed to one X near the study. That's the hidden compartment we just found. And look, there's another X in the wine cellar. The wine cellar? Sally's eyes widened. That's where the staff reported hearing noises the night of the theft. Exactly, Tony said, already heading for the door. Come on, let's check it out. The wine cellar. The wine cellar was cold and dimly lit, its stone walls lined with racks of dusty bottles. Sally and Tony descended the narrow staircase cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. Do you think the chalice could be hidden down here? Tony whispered. It's possible, Sally replied, scanning the room. But if it is, the thief must have had a reason for leaving it behind. They began searching the cellar, moving methodically from one rack to the next. It was Tony who found it, a loose stone in the wall partially concealed behind a stack of wine crates. "Over here!" he called, prying the stone free. Behind it was a small, hollowed-out space, and inside that space was the chalice. Sally stared at it in astonishment. "I don't believe it. The thief didn't take it. They hid it." "But why?" Tony asked, pulling the chalice out carefully. Sally's mind raced. Maybe they panicked, or maybe they needed to come back for it later when no one was watching. She examined the chalice closely. It was an exquisite piece, its gold surface gleaming even in the dim light. But as she turned it over, she noticed something unusual, a tiny crest engraved on the base. "Tony, look at this," she said, pointing to the crest. Tony squinted at it. "Is that the Blackwood family crest?" Sally nodded, her pulse quickening. "This chalice isn't just valuable, it's part of the Blackwood family's legacy. Whoever stole it must have known that." A sudden realization. As they climbed back up the stairs, Sally's mind was racing. The letter, the map, the hidden chalice, they were all pieces of a larger puzzle. And then it hit her. "Tony," she said, stopping abruptly. "The brooch, Aunt Beatrice's brooch, it has the same clasp as the velvet pouch." Tony frowned. "You think she's involved?" "I don't know," Sally admitted. "But it's too much of a coincidence to ignore. We need to confront her, and we need Sergeant Peters with us." Tony grinned. "Now you're talking. Let's solve this thing once and for all." Chapter 9. The Culprit Unmasked. Sally and Tony wasted no time in summoning Sergeant Peters. The local policeman arrived promptly, his heavy boots echoing in the Manor's grand foyer as he greeted the young sleuths. "You've got something for me, then?" he asked, adjusting his cap. Sally nodded, holding up the chalice they had recovered from the wine cellar. "We've found the chalice, Sergeant. It was hidden behind a loose stone in the cellar." Peter's eyebrows shot up. "Well, I'll be. So the thief didn't get away with it after all. Any idea who stashed it there?" "We believe so," Sally replied. "But we'll need everyone gathered in the sitting room for the full explanation." The gathering. 15 minutes later, the sitting room was filled with the suspects: Arthur, Evelyn, Carruthers, and Aunt Beatrice. The tension was palpable as Sally and Tony stood before them, the recovered chalice placed on a table beside Sergeant Peters. "Well?" Carruthers barked impatiently. "What's all this about? Do you know who the thief is or not?" "We do," Sally said calmly. "And the evidence we've gathered points to one person." She began pacing the room, her sharp eyes moving from one suspect to the next. The theft of the Blackwood chalice was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was carefully planned, she began. The thief knew the layout of the manor intimately, including the location of the hidden compartment in the study and the secret hiding spot in the wine cellar. That narrows our suspects to those who are familiar with this house. Her gaze landed on Arthur. "Arthur, you've been struggling with debts for years. The sale of the chalice would have solved all your financial woes. But while you had motive, you lack the cunning to pull off such a calculated crime." Arthur flushed, muttering something under his breath, but Sally had already moved on. "Evelyn," she said, turning to the Squire's niece, "you were visibly distraught when the theft was discovered. At first, I thought your reaction might be an act, but the more I observed you, the more I realized you were genuinely shocked. You may have had the opportunity, but you lacked the intent." Evelyn let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her face. "That leaves us with two suspects," Sally continued, her tone sharp. "Carruthers and Aunt Beatrice." The final clue. Sally picked up the chalice and turned it over, pointing to the crest engraved on its base. "This chalice isn't just valuable. It's a symbol of the Blackwood family's legacy. The thief would have to know its significance, which makes Aunt Beatrice a prime suspect. After all, who would care more about a family heirloom than someone tied to the Blackwood name?" Beatrice's face remained impassive, but her grip on the armrest of her chair tightened. However, Sally said, her voice growing firmer, Aunt Beatrice didn't act alone. This was a two-person job requiring both brains and access to the Manor's secrets, and that brings us to Carruthers. Carruthers shot to his feet. "This is preposterous! I've done nothing wrong!" "Sit down, Carruthers," Sergeant Peters growled, his hand resting on the baton at his side. Sally stepped closer to the table. "Carruthers, you were seen near the study the night of the theft, and we found this—" she held up the burnt fragment of the letter— "in the fireplace. The handwriting matches yours. You wrote instructions for the theft and burned the evidence, but not all of it." Carruthers' face turned crimson. "You have no proof!" "We have enough," Sally countered, "including the velvet pouch hidden in the study, which contained keys to the Manor. The clasp on that pouch matches the one on Aunt Beatrice's brooch. She provided you with access, didn't she?" Beatrice stood abruptly, her calm demeanor shattered. "Enough of this nonsense! You have no idea what you're talking about!" Sally's eyes locked onto hers. "Don't I? You knew the chalice's value better than anyone, and you knew Carruthers had the connections to sell it. You planned to split the profits, didn't you? But something went wrong, and the chalice was hidden in the wine cellar to avoid suspicion." The confession. The room fell silent. Beatrice's composure cracked, and she sank back into her chair. "Fine," she said, her voice bitter. "Yes, I planned it. Do you know what it's like to watch your family's fortune dwindle away while Arthur squanders it on his foolish ventures? I did what I had to do to protect this family." "And you dragged me into it," Carruthers spat. "I should never have trusted you." "You were happy enough to take your share of the profits," Beatrice snapped. Sergeant Peters stepped forward, his expression grim. "That's enough. Beatrice, Blackwood, Carruthers, you're both under arrest for theft and conspiracy." As Peters placed them in handcuffs, Tony turned to Sally with a grin. "You did it, Sally. You cracked the case." Sally smiled, though her expression was tinged with sadness. "I only wish it hadn't come to this. Aunt Beatrice may have acted out of desperation, but theft is theft." Epilogue. Later that evening, as the guests began to leave the Manor, Sally and Tony stood by the fireplace, sipping hot chocolate. "Well," Tony said, "another mystery solved. Think we'll ever get invited to a party that doesn't end in a crime?" Sally laughed. "Not likely, but where's the fun in that?" As the snow continued to fall outside, the two friends clinked their mugs together, ready for whatever mystery awaited them next.